Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Intuit Developer Friday Morning Hangout for October 27th, 2017. Today, we have a special edition of the Hangout. We actually are going to start getting ready for the Small Business Hack event, which is coming up very, very soon. In about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we will be in San Jose QuickBooks Connect will be in San Jose, but we'll, for the hackathon, be in Mountain View at Building 20 of the Intuit headquarters, and I have a slide kind of covering some details on that in a moment. I'm your host, David Leary. I'm the Intuit Small Business Ecosystem Evangelist. You can follow me at David Leary. Today, our guests are coming from Google Assistant, who you can follow on Twitter, Actions on Google. We have Sachit Mishra and Shuyang Chen. They are both from the Google Developer Program as engineers. So they're going to show the APIs that you can do to best utilize Google Assistant in your hacks at the hackathon. And I need to click and get it to work here. Click. There it goes. So as a reminder, November 11th and 12th in Mountain View, California, we are going to do the Small Business Hackathon. It's going to actually be inside that building in the photograph there. That's the brand new Building 20 that Intuit built. It's really cool. There's like a 4-story floating staircase. There's a huge wall of seats. There's cubes that stick out of the wall. They're just like hanging over the edges. So it should be a lot of exciting. Please sign up if you haven't signed up already at smallbizhack.com and come to the event. And if you want, you could stay the whole week, and the rest of the week you can do QuickBooks Connect. So QuickBooksConnect.com, you can come and get inspired. We'll have about 700 developers there. We'll have about 2,700 accountants there, and then the rest of the people that will attend will be small businesses, and it'll probably fill out to about 5,000, headed towards 6,000 people at that event. And it's a celebration of small business, but we do have tracks for accountants, and we do have tracks specifically for developers on the main day and the finale day. So definitely try to book this into your calendar and then come to that event as well. And then, like always, you can find this and any other future events that we're doing on the hub page. It's just developer.intuit.com/hub/events. And next week, we're going to have Nexmo, who's another Small Biz Hack partner. And then the week after that, we'll have Intuit QuickBooks, who's also a Small Biz Hack partner. So 3 weeks in a row, all related to the hackathon, leading up to the actual hackathon on November 11th and 12th in Mountain View, California. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing here and get things handed off here. So, Sachit, if you want to unmute, and welcome. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks.
It's interesting. I'm actually traveling, so I'm in South Carolina. So usually this is for me is the morning. It's like a Friday morning hangout. So now it's noon here. So I'm kind of doing a lunchtime hangout. I'm actually at a conference. I had to jump downstairs into a different room. So if you hear walking or noises, please forgive me. That's some people walking on this upstairs level above me ahead. But please introduce yourself and your team and tell us about Google Assistant.
Sure. So yeah, thanks, David, for having us. My name is Sachit Mishra. I'm on the Actions on Google Developer Relations team. So I am joined by my colleague remotely, Suyang, who I think his video is having a little bit of problems, but he's on the call. And we both work on a couple things for the platform, mainly tooling that the developers can use, as well as samples, outreach, things like this. We'll be at the hackathon in a couple weekends. And we also feed developer feedback back into the product. So I'll be curious for your feedback here and at the hackathon as well in terms of bringing it back to the product team. Just to make sure real quick, can you hear me? My MacBook fan is kind of going a little crazy. But hopefully you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, everything seems to be okay.
Okay,
so
great.
when you say Google Assistant, is that just the piece of hardware? I think it's called Google Home, and then I have an Android phone, and I can say okay Google, and I get that. Like, what is Google Assistant?
Well, actually, that's a great way to start off with some slides. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here.
Got it.
And get into some, whoops, I'm a little bit ahead here. Sorry about that. Things earlier. Okay, anyway,
Perfect.
I'll start back at the beginning. If you can see my slides. So yeah, let's get into your question actually, because that's a great place to start. So the Google Assistant is basically this new initiative by Google that's built around conversation. And the idea is it's a conversation between the user and Google. And we want it to have actionable effects in your world. We want it to help you get things done in your world. And essentially, it's the software that connects a lot of different modalities and allows the user to interact with Google through those modalities. So some of those surfaces might be something like the Google Home devices, which we have now, or even mobile devices, the Android phones and the iOS Assistant app. And the actions on Google platform is what allows developers to extend the assistant. So when I say extend the assistant, what I mean is that the developers don't necessarily give the assistant new capabilities, but they give the assistant new interactive, basically kind of like modes for the user to interact with their service, right? So an example could be something that it's basically a conversation that you're owning between a user and yourself, and it's facilitated through Google. So like I was saying, an example could be one that we built for the Google I/O conference back in May. So the way this would have worked is on a Google Home device or on a mobile device with the assistant running, the user could have spoken something like, after invoking the Google Assistant with something like, okay, Google, or hey, Google, they could say something like, let's talk to Google I/O 17. And there's an invocation name that's very important there, Google I/O 17. Google then hands off the conversation, and the user will hear an entirely new voice as the rest of the conversation continues. So now they're speaking to another, basically, persona. And at that point, the developer is owning the conversation through their app for assistant, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And so in the Google I/O app, it asks you, for instance, if you want to know about sessions for I/O, the user input, speech input is processed, and then it can respond with all sorts of things. And so the conversation carries on, so forth. So
in a way, it's like making a phone call. So I'm going to say, okay, Google, I'm going to chat with McDonald's, or I'm going to chat with Starbucks, or whatever it might be. And then I'm kind of, in a way, and then I'm invoking a chat with that third party.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple different metaphors we have for it. One that our design, I mean, that's not an inaccurate one. One that our designer likes to push was, it's like meeting someone at a party. So the Google Assistant introduces you to someone new that might help you get something done specific to their service. But anyway, yeah, you have totally the right idea.
Got it.
So I'll have to move through this deck a little bit fast, but I will just say at a high level, we have a lot of partners, and I encourage you to go ahead and use this as soon as you're off the call. You can access these, like I was saying, on Google Home devices if you have them, or even on the Assistant on iOS and Android. So you can give it a shot. But let's talk a little bit about the technical side of it. So like I was saying, the developer owns the conversation, and the way this works is that for every turn of dialogue, for every back and forth, the user input is basically given to the assistant, and the assistant transforms that into an API request that goes to the developer's app. And the developer simply responds, and the response is transcribed to speech or text, actually, even on visual devices. And then that's given to the user. So it's kind of like a reverse API, because the API sort of calls you, and you're responsible for returning a response in the appropriate format. So taking another kind of deeper look here, like I was saying before, suppose the user invokes on one of their assistant surfaces. At first, what happens is the assistant tries to handle a request, and it does this through all this sort of NLP and knowledge graph ranking and all this stuff that Google's been building up for the last X number of years. And when it realizes that the user is trying to invoke against a developer app, it'll hand over the fulfillment of that request to the developer's cloud endpoint. And then the developer's cloud endpoint, which is sort of this third column, it is responsible for handling these high-level intents, which are what the Google Assistant gives to the endpoint in terms of like what the user is trying to get done. So in this case, the main intent just means, hey, the user is trying to is invoking you, and you should greet them, basically. Got it. Sorry. So the Google Assistant hands off the app. Sure, here's Google I/O 17, and then the app can give some initial response, like, hey, welcome to Google I/O. And that greeting is pretty important to nail down. We'll talk a little bit about design later, but it really sets the stage for the rest of the conversation. At that point, any further user input until the conversation ends is passed directly to the cloud endpoint of the app, and any responses are sent back to the user as speech. And this continues until until basically the app ends the conversation. The user has a couple ways to end the conversation as well, by these sort of predefined exit phrases. But in most cases, the developer will end the conversation when it makes sense. So If you look at the, sorry, real quick, actually, just stay another second here. If you look at the hardest part of this, it's not necessarily that the technological infrastructure here is very difficult. It's not super difficult to set up a server that handles requests and sends out responses. I think the hardest part of this whole framework is understanding language, because the Google Assistant doesn't necessarily do any massaging on the incoming text from the user. So your endpoint will be responsible for doing all sorts of natural language processing, understanding conversational state, and sending responses accordingly. And because that's not very easy for everyone to do unless you have employees who have PhDs in natural language processing and things like that, we have a product called Dialogflow, which my computer will go to the next slide here. Oh, sorry, it's moving a little bit ahead. Okay, yep, we have a product called Dialogflow, which basically does two important things for you. One is intent matching. So this is basically the idea of taking incoming user speech and making sense of unstructured data. So it matches at a high level what the user is trying to get done at every turn of dialogue. And it also does entity extraction. So this is pretty important because you need to both understand the high level basically intent of the user for every turn, and you need to understand certain clues in their speech which will help you get that thing done or help you respond accordingly. So just a real quick slide here about terminology. It's not important that you understand the terminology in this slide. What's important is that it gives you a survey of some of the terms I'll be using, and also that you understand that the Actions on Google platform and the Dialogflow tool have some differences in naming. So it's just something to be aware of. Basically, in AOG, intents are very high-level forms of input, whereas intents in Dialogflow are matched at every turn of conversation, and they always correspond to some incoming user utterance. And then actions also have a different meaning. So actions in Actions on Google are basically entry points into your conversation, whereas actions in Dialogflow are kind of a mapping to an intent. So you'll have multiple actions in a conversation, whereas actions on Google may have only a few entry points to a larger conversation. In any case, let's take a look at how the architecture changes. So if you're using Dialogflow, what will happen is instead of the incoming user speech going directly to your cloud endpoint, it'll first go to Dialogflow, which will end up doing some interesting maybe intent matching and entity extraction, like I was saying. And then that structured data becomes the request to your cloud endpoint. So the unstructured user utterance request that's coming into Dialogflow becomes structured and becomes much easier to deal with. And then your cloud endpoint can be responsible for forming any responses you might want, or looking at some database for external data, etc. So now I have some screenshots here. Now you have to forgive me. API AI was the old name of Dialogflow. They just renamed it a couple of weeks ago, so I haven't got a chance to fully update all my content yet. But this is how Dialogflow looks, except the logo in the top left will be different.
Okay, good. So for those of you who attended the hackathon last year, API.ai actually was at the hackathon last year. And so some of you, if you want to go even deeper on this, there's a video you can go on Google and find on YouTube last year's video.
Yeah, and we're always working on making more online like YouTube video content and blog posts and that kind of thing. So okay. Hopefully there'll be enough material out there that if I'm going over something that you're missing or whatever, there's something out there you can use.
Got it.
In any case, this was a look at the intent screen for Dialogflow. So the idea is that you give Dialogflow some examples for every turn of dialogue of what you expect the user to say. And these may include entities, which Dialogflow will know how to extract. But you only have to give it, let's say, 10 or 12 examples. And the idea is that using machine learning and using grammar expansion, Dialogflow will be able to understand, even if the user doesn't say your examples verbatim, it'll be able to understand at a high level what the intent is. You can also have in Dialogflow follow-up intents. So let's say your conversation looks like this. It has a list of intents. So at every point, the user utterance tries to get matched to one of these. You can also enforce some directionality in your conversation. So you can also include these follow-up intents, which will only be triggered once a user has triggered one of the parent intents. So the idea here basically is that I'm just trying to get across that Dialogflow can be used not only just to do NLP strictly speaking, but also to do some conversational design for your entire app.
Okay.
This is enforced through something called contexts. So basically, like I was saying, you basically can enforce directionality in your conversation by exiting and entering context at certain times. And then the entities are what I was mentioning earlier, where there might be key phrases that you need Dialogflow to listen for in the incoming speech. And then based on those, you might respond accordingly. So sorry, my slides are freezing up here a little bit again. Oh, there we go. There's two kinds of entities. One are system entities. So these are entities that Dialogflow already knows how to pick up on. So it already knows how to pick up when the user is talking about a speed or an age. But then you may have very niche domain-specific entities. So you can actually teach Dialogflow about these phrases, give examples, and even allow Dialogflow to do further grammar expansion on them. And then when the user speaks these phrases, Dialogflow can pick it up. And then when it calls out to your cloud endpoint, it'll be able to send that as part of the structured data as well. So for instance, if I was writing a app that wanted the user to, was going to give the user some cooking advice, and part of that was I would need to know what the user would want to cook, I could specify that they would need to give me a protein, a vegetable, maybe a cooking speed, and then Dialogflow can handle picking these things up. So let's say they just tell me the protein. They say, I want to cook some chicken tonight. And that intent gets matched, but I don't have all the data I need yet. Dialogflow can actually do follow-up prompts without creating any new intents or anything. You can just teach it to do some follow-up prompts, and it'll get all the data it needs before that entity is fully matched and any requests, structured data requests are sent to your endpoint. And again, I'm moving a little fast through this, I know. So I encourage you to try all this out. I'll try to do a demo if it works out later and at the end of this. And then all of this stuff I'm going over is available online through our documentation and samples. But in any case, the cloud endpoint that I was mentioning earlier, which will allow you to provide sort of dynamic responses throughout the conversation, which might allow you to do external API calls or database checks and things like that. That's enabled through something called fulfillment. So basically what you do is you put a URL in Dialogflow, and this is simply responsible for receiving HTTPS post requests and sending the correctly formatted response. So this is an example of what the request looks like. So you have the query, which is that unstructured user utterance, and then you have structured data coming out of it, including the actual intent that was matched, some of the parameters that were needed, and things like that. Now, interacting with this API can be a little bit difficult. So we have a client library in Node.js that we built for the Actions on Google platform, which can also be used if you don't use Dialogflow. So if you want to do your own natural language processing, our client library can still be useful. But basically, it's written primarily for basically express style request responses. So we intend it to be used, for instance, with Google Cloud's functions or Firebase functions. But it can be also used in App Engine and things like that. And it can help you interact with the incoming request because you saw it was kind of messy JSON. We used to have some convenience helpers and also format the response accordingly. So you don't have to handle figuring out all the JSON yourself. We also have that JSON and all the reference documentation online. So if you're not using Node.js or you're not using our client library, it's all there as well. So we have a sample, which I'm going to try to go over a little bit later, which is called Facts About Google. We have a lot of samples, but this one's a little bit of the intermediate level. And I think it shows off really a couple cool features of the platform. So the way the conversational flow goes in this sample is the user may invoke by saying, okay, we'll talk to Facts About Google. And a welcome intent in API, in Dialogflow is matched. And at that point, some response is sent back to the user. And they're allowed to hear, they're asked if they want to hear facts about Google's history or about its headquarters. And then Dialogflow is trained to listen for that response. So if they say, tell me about Google's headquarters, I want to know about Google's headquarters, etc., the machine learning and the grammar expansion handles understanding all of that and parsing it all to the choose fact intent. Similarly, one of the really cool features of our platform is called deep linking or implicit triggering. So the way this works is rather than always entering the conversation at the same point, you can actually add another deep link, and this is actually another action in the Actions on Google universe, where by saying a little bit more in the invocation, the user can jump to a certain part of the conversation. So instead of just saying talk to facts about Google, if they say talk to facts about Google's history, what ends up happening is the app routes already to that intent, so they don't have to go through a welcome flow every time. So when you're actually building out your conversation and you specify all these entry points, these are your actions. And they will, if you evolve them and continue to support them and maintain them, they'll allow your user to have much more sophisticated interactions. The other cool thing about this is that those same phrases that you train it to listen for, so in this case, if they say Google's history, it'll shortcut into that part of the conversation. Those same phrases are used as a discovery mechanism. So if I have no idea about what facts about Google is, and I just say, okay, Google, I want to know about Google's history, if this is a published app, it's very possible, based on some ranking that Google does, that the facts about Google app will be suggested to the user without them even having to know what it is. Anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's one of the coolest features of the platform. But continuing with this sample, if you get to that part of the conversation, you're given a response, which is an actual fact about Google, and then you're asked if you want to hear another one, and you basically cycle like that. So if you want to hear another one, you say sure, or yes, or yeah, why not, or something like that, and you're given another fact, you're prompted for whether you want to hear another one, and the facts are actually being pulled from our fulfillment web service. So in our sample, which you can get from GitHub, the web service is a Firebase function which has basically a bank of facts to pull from, and these are presented to the user. And as they keep saying yes, they're in this follow-up context where they'll continue to get those facts. And at any point, they can say, no, I don't want to hear a fact, or I'm done, or something. The quit facts intent is triggered. Some goodbye message is sent out, excuse me, and then they're done with the conversation. There's also a parallel part of our conversation where if they want to hear about cats, they can both enter the conversation there, or at any point during the conversation ask about cats, and they'll get a bunch of facts about cats. Similarly, those facts are served from our fulfillment service. So this is a quick code snippet of the sample. I'll be talking a little bit more about this. Let me see what I'm doing on time. So basically what I want to show you is that in addition to these sort of audio responses that you might get on like a speaker device, like a home, on visual devices like Android or iOS devices, you can really show some cool visual elements. So this one, for instance, has a card which has an image. It has suggestion chips at the bottom. And the way this works is that if you can figure out based on the incoming request if the user is on a screen device or an audio device, and you can accordingly set your response to match the incoming device. So this brings me to my next point, which is that at Actions on Google, one of the things we're really trying to push is creating quality conversational experiences rather than sort of, stunted conversations that end up leading to a lot of frustration, right? So part of that is you're trying to build an experience for the user by, for instance, creating a persona. So one thing that's really important to understand is when any user is interacting with your conversational app, they're going to be assigning it a persona, especially in the cases where there is audio. It's a natural human instinct to kind of compare semi-human interactions to actual human beings. And so the important thing here is to really own your persona. So one of the things we recommend is actually taking time before writing the app to write down a one-pager on who this person is, or whether it's a person or an object or an alien, who they are, why they are what they are, what they do, why they do what they do, what inspires them, what drives them. And I mean, as a developer, honestly, as an engineer, this sometimes strikes me as a little bit of a waste of time. I just want to get to writing code. But the coolest thing about this, I think, is that it actually informs all of the little micro decisions you make about the way the conversation will go, as well as the wording, the phrasing, the semantics of the responses. And because of that, I think it's really worth the time investment. The next thing, sorry, my computer's again a little freezing up here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So the next thing is designing for multiple surfaces. So I alluded to this earlier, but basically the platform has two main capabilities for devices right now. Pretty simple: audio output and screen output. Sorry, was there someone had a question or something? Or?
No, I just moved.
Sorry. Okay.
I might have bumped a chair. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So screen output and audio output. So basically those will be sent to you in the incoming request. When the request tells you what the user says, it'll also tell you what device capabilities they have. And so based on that, you can tailor your response. And let's see here. It's still freezing up a little bit. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, there we go. Okay. So yeah, so I mentioned the different capabilities. So if they're on a home device, obviously they will only have audio output capabilities. So based on this, you can do a couple things. You can, for instance, have different audio speech come out that's different than the actual text that's being shown on the visual device. You can have suggestion chips at the bottom, which guide the user. And this is actually super useful because one of the things about creating a conversational app is that there's no guidelines. There's no rails to keep the user on. And so when they're on a visual device, giving them suggestion chips, giving them something to hold on to is really helpful. You can show cards, like I mentioned earlier, which can even have links out to a web page. If they're using it on an Android device and your Android app is installed on the device and is set to recognize the HTTPS intent for Android for your service, then they can basically get to your Android app instantly from here. And there's also lists and carousels that they can choose from. So we offer some really cool visual elements that allow the user to interact with your app pretty richly on a visual device. It's also important to know the user. So we give a couple meaningful ways to do this. So one is our permissions API. So if you need to get their name and their location, you can do that. Another is that you can actually have them log into your service at the start of the conversation. So if you have an existing OAuth solution and a user account system, you can have them log into that. We also support transactions with the user. So these are payments-based or non-payments-based transactions where they can actually make orders. They can actually check on order status later through the assistant settings. And so this is pretty powerful. You can do payments processing and things like that. So yeah, we're really hoping that some merchants start using our platform as well. So this is an example of how this might look. So if they're on a visual device doing a transaction, they can choose an address, they can look at receipts, and they do this all conversationally through the assistant. And then later they can look at the status of the order or the receipt as they please. So now that you understand maybe like how the platform works and some of the features of the platform, the question is, how do you actually get to the users? And like I mentioned earlier, the main form of discovery, or sorry, the main form of invocation that we have is a very explicit invocation. As they're speaking to the Google Assistant, they use some trigger phrase that we support, like let's talk to, or I think ask is, we have a list of supported ones in our documentation. And then a invocation name that you as the developer specify. So this will be based on whatever service you have or based on the persona you design. You may have some invocation name that represents that. And then they can also do, like I was mentioning earlier, linking into a certain part of your app through an action phrase. So rather than just saying, let's talk to Google I/O 17, they could say, talk to Google or ask Google I/O 17 about, so that kind of tells Google Assistant like, okay, they're gonna try to say something more. about what was announced. And then your app is responsible for basically taking that part of the input and routing it to a certain part of the conversation, which Dialogflow can help with. But the cool feature that I was mentioning earlier, the implicit triggering feature, is that those same phrases that you can use as action phrases, like what was announced, or you can imagine other phrases for your specific service, can be used as a discovery mechanism if the user doesn't know about your app. So again, this is if they just say something directly to the Google Assistant and what they say is something that your app is prepared to handle, then the Google Assistant can surface your app as a suggestion for the user. And like I was mentioning earlier, this is based on a lot of internal ranking that we're working on at Google, where we're actually still really kind of trying to perfect the system, trying to nail it down, trying to improve discovery, trying to improve the implicit triggering story all the time. And so this is something we're going to continue to grow. But if you're looking for advice on how to design these phrases to maximize for discovery, on our documentation, we have some guidelines there. The high-level thing is to make these phrases that you listen for, to make them actionable, and don't make them sort of too broad, as in trying to catch a wide net, because that may end up actually hurting your ranking. But yeah, we see this as like a really important feature that we're always trying to improve and build out, and it's a major discovery mechanism in the platform. The other way that the user might get to your app is very simply going to the directory in the Google Assistant. So in the Google Assistant app, if they navigate to that blue button that you might have seen at the beginning of this animation here, they can get to an Explore tab, which has all of the published and live apps up there. There are ratings. There's buttons that they can try the app directly and see some sample deep link triggers. So excuse me. So that's a really helpful feature for users who are looking to explore these kind of things. And you can also actually share this link to your directory page. You can get it through our console. And then you can promote that link through whatever channels you already have, like your own website or your own apps or your own like mobile apps or social media or what have you. And so you can basically leverage your existing marketing channels to get this done. So I'm almost done here. I'm going to just leave a quick note about what we think makes a great app. Like I was mentioning earlier, quality is a big part of the platform and of what we're trying to get developers to do. So when you're trying to think of a conversational use case, it can be difficult, and the number one thing you don't want to do is mapping an existing mobile or web app to conversation directly. That pretty much never works out. You have to think about unconventional ways that people interact with your service and leverage those. And a lot of those ways may end up being faster through conversation. So one example that I've used even recently, I was trying to buy a laptop, and I was at some electronics store website, and they had this tool where you kind of pick, roughly what memory you want, what hard drive storage you want, what kind of processor you want, and then by answering a few simple questions, it'll come up with a list of suggestions that's much more narrowed down than if I had to go to the entire laptop listing, use the filtering feature on the left, the visual filtering feature. So you can imagine how something like that, if it were facilitated through conversation in an elegant and efficient way, it would actually make the laptop purchasing experience in that case much simpler. And so in addition to making it kind of a faster use case that you're not just porting over a mobile app, it's also important to make it personal, because these conversational apps, like I was mentioning earlier, they will be compared to human interaction, and B, it actually makes the conversation a lot faster if it's personal. Discoverable is, what we mean by that as a feature of your app is that the app should not have hidden features from the user. So if the user needs to read a manual to figure out all the parts of the conversation, that's not a very high quality app. Instead, your app should take opportunities to surface new features or surface capabilities that it can do throughout the conversation. It should also be proactive. So when they're invoking it, it should use that personalization that it has to surface the right information for the given user. And then it should be ubiquitous in that we ideally would like all developers to support all of our services, which is actually pretty easy to do because as long as you're providing some speech output, which you have to do on, like, say, a Google Home device, you will be supported on visual devices. But the important thing is that on visual devices, for instance, maybe you tailor the experience to have more rich interactions like cards and lists and things like that. So if you're interested in this, you want to know where to start, or maybe you're looking into using it for the upcoming event, one of the first places you want to visit probably is our console. So this is console.actions.google.com. You can create projects, actions projects there. There's also links to our documentation there and some of our samples. But what I would say actually is, and this is going to talk about design for a bit here. Like I mentioned earlier, I would recommend first maybe exploring our documentation a bit, but putting away the code and thinking about your persona. And once you've thought about your persona, maybe drafted at least a paragraph on what your persona is and what it's going to do and why it does what it does and what its whatever interests and what it drives it, motivations. Write out some draft dialogue. So just some back and forth between the user and that persona, the way the persona would respond, what kind of input you're expecting from the user. And then you might end up with something like a movie script, like a simple short movie script. And again, something like what I have on the left here. And then eventually, once you've figured out the dialogues, sample dialogues, you can start to conceive of a structure for your conversation, a flow for the dialogue, a dialogue flow, if you will. And at this point, you're kind of, I think, ready to start adding intents in dialogue flow, and start building out your webhook, your endpoint to give dynamic responses. The important thing I will say here is that a lot of developers, they come up with a dialogue tree and they think that they are ready to go in terms of user interactions. And the number one thing you find out when you start testing with real users is that they have no idea how your dialogue structure looks, and they're going to use it in ways you've never predicted. They're going to go all over your dialogue tree make paths between nodes that you never expected to support. And then any cool features you have in your conversation, any contextual surfacing, anything like that may be broken. So the number one thing I recommend is when you have your sort of dialogue tree, don't consider that the last step. Consider every single possible interaction between the nodes of the tree. That's why it's probably important to, at first, keep your tree relatively simple and try to create a quality experience and then build on that. So a lot of our design guidance is available through our documentation website. So you can go here and learn a lot about conversational design. Just in general, actually, it's not necessarily 100% platform specific. A lot of it just applies to conversation design in general. And then we also have some video resources on YouTube. There's an introductory video, there's a conversation design video, and then I also have a screencast where I go through every step from beginning to end of building out one of these apps. And so I encourage you to try that one out, check it out. In a moment here, I'm going to try to actually go over some of the stuff I go over in that video, but that video has every single step starting from scratch, so I may skip some of that, and that video will have it. But yeah, we also have a G+ community, which is pretty active. You can get help from other developers there. My team, the developer relations team, monitors that community and tries to answer questions. We also make posts and announcements there when new features come out and things like that. And there's, of course, our documentation, which I highly recommend you check out. So that is my presentation, and I'm going to jump into a demo now, if that sounds good.
While you're flipping over, just a reminder, anybody that's sitting in here and attending live, please use the Q&A panel to ask any questions, and I can relay those back. If not, at the end of the code demo, we can actually just open up the floor, and if people want to ask questions real time over the microphone and camera, we can do that.
Okay, great. Yeah. I'm not great at using Zoom, so I can't see the chat. So yeah, like David said, just if he could surface those questions to me as they're coming.
Definitely will.
Yeah, great. So like I was mentioning earlier, the console.actions.google.com is a great place to start, and it's where you're going to be starting your journey in terms of creating the app for Assistant. This is an example of a project I've already created in the console, and you can see that it has some options, like I can add some app information. That's the information that will actually be shown in your directory listing. I can do location targeting. So Actions on Google is supported in a few countries right now, including some in Europe. I think we're in Japan right now, and the United States and the UK. So you can actually target certain regions. And also, by the way, you can build your app for different languages. I won't have time to talk about that now, but our documentation, excuse me, details some of that. So, so in the console, what I'm going to do is, if I'm creating this new app, I'll go to Add Actions. And we have a few options here. So the number one option for most conversational apps, for most people, is going to be Dialogflow. Actions SDK is what you choose if you don't want to use Dialogflow and you have your own natural language understanding, intent matching, and all that in your backend. But we also have these templates at the bottom. I want to take a moment to highlight these. These templates at the bottom are really cool. What they allow you to do is create an entire conversational app, no coding required, using only some data that you plug into Google Sheets. So it can make a trivia game for you or a personality quiz for you. The personas are already built out. The conversation and error handling, or excuse me, conversation repair is already built out. So those are really cool ways to get started and publish an app within a few hours or even less than that. So I recommend that if you want to go to the console and just start there and build an app there, you can do that, and it's pretty easy. But what I'm going to show you how to do is build using Dialogflow. So I'll click here and go into Dialogflow. So normally, if you click in Dialogflow and this is your first time creating an agent in Dialogflow from that new project, you'll see a page where you get to, sort of initialize the agent. I have an agent set up, and my intents here are, you can actually pull this from our GitHub sample for this, our GitHub repo for this sample. So this is the GitHub repo. It's listed in our documentation and in our Actions on Google org in GitHub. But this Facts About Google zip file here, this can be basically imported into Dialogflow, and you'll get all these intents right there. So I'm going to expand this here. So this is basically in my entire conversation for my Facts About Google sample that I was talking about earlier. So it has a welcome intent. This will be triggered when they first access the app. It greets the user. It has a fallback intent. So if at any point I don't expect, there's some user input that I don't expect, that can be triggered. And then it also has like a choose fact intent. And so what I'm going to do is look in there real quick. So this is the intent I was mentioning earlier, where if they get to the welcome intent and I say, what kind of fact do they want to know, history or headquarters, they may say history. They may say, I want to know about history. They might want to say, tell me about the history, whatever their phrasing might be. There are some examples I've given to Dialogflow here, and then Dialogflow uses grammar expansion to figure out all of the possible variations and match this intent. And similarly, what I've done is I've told Dialogflow about two values for an entity, which is what type of fact, history or headquarters. So you can see that Dialogflow highlights in my examples the way that it'll pick up those the preference from the user, and that gets translated into structured data that ends up going to my bank of facts. That's how I choose which fact to present to them. And there's some which aren't highlighted, and these are in the cases where the user doesn't actually provide me with the type of fact. They just say something like, I want to hear about Google. They don't tell me whether they want to hear about Google's headquarters or history. So what happens down here is I told Dialogflow, listen, this is a required parameter of this intent. So if they trigger this intent, but they haven't given me a entity value for the type of fact, I've given some prompts here which Dialogflow will speak to the user until it gets one of those. And when it gets one of those fact types, it'll end up then going to my webhook, my fulfillment, to actually provide the response. If I just wanted to do a hard-coded response, I could type something here into this text response field. But I actually want a dynamic response, so I want it to go to my webhook and get the response.
Oh, there you
go. Yeah, sorry, my computer's being a little laggy, so you're not seeing everything I'm typing right away. But anyway, so I want to take a quick look at how that webhook actually looks. So I have the code up here. Let me scroll to the top of this. So this is directly from the GitHub repo, my directory structure here. I've just completely cloned it. It's written to be used for Firebase functions. So the important file to get to is this index.js file in the functions directory. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of our code in our client library, our code applies to any Express-style Node.js framework. So if you want to use App Engine or Cloud Functions on Google Cloud, it'll work the same. So basically what I'm doing is I'm importing a class from the Actions on Google NPM package, which we have published. And then for every intent in the conversation, so I'll go back to my list of intents. For every intent of in the conversation, I've basically defined, let me scroll down a little bit here to get past this code. Again, I highly recommend you take a look at this. I've defined some JavaScript function handler. So this is one intent in Dialogflow. This is another intent in Dialogflow, these actions dot constants. And then the corresponding JavaScript function is called. And in those functions, you can see in line 256, for instance, I call from our client library class a ask method. And I send some response, basically, and this gets sent out to the user. I know I'm moving a little fast through this, and again, I recommend you actually clone the repo, create a project, and copy our code, deploy it, and try this out. But this is how it's working at a high level. We have a strings.js file here, which is basically all of the actual speech content that we're sending in our responses to the users. So it's pretty easy to modify there. And then this is the actual function that's being called from Dialogflow. So I get a request in from Dialogflow. I initialize this class from our client library. And then I call a handle request, which takes this map of intents, calls the corresponding JavaScript function for the given incoming intent, and then sends some response back. And in Dialogflow, the URL for my Firebase function is here in the fulfillment section. And now when I go to integrations and I want to use my app in the Google Assistant integration, by the way, Dialogflow supports a lot of integration platforms. I can go ahead and hit test. And then there is a view button, which takes me back actually to the Actions console. And there's a simulator. And now if the demo gods are pleased with me, I can invoke my app here as if I was on a Google Assistant surface. But I just don't say the actual OK Google part. But I do say what I would say after. So I would say talk to my test app. The reason it's called my test app is that's a default. You can actually give it a real name when you publish the app. But when you first create your app, it's called talk to my test app. And
sure. Let's get the test version of my test app. Welcome to Facts About Google. Do you want to hear about Google's history, or do you want to hear about its headquarters?
So you're seeing that I'm actually getting a rich visual response because I've told the simulator that I want to interact with it as if I'm on a phone. I could also choose a speaker device like Google Home. I'm getting some debug information on the right side, which is like the actual request that was sent to Dialogflow, because Dialogflow here acts as middleware. Excuse me. I'm actually seeing the request that was sent to Dialogflow, and I'm seeing the response that was sent back from Dialogflow. And I can also mess with I can also hear the audio here and stuff like that. So you have some, pretty powerful features here. And one thing I actually think the slides might have missed because because of some freezing issues was the idea of SSML. So SSML, speech synthesis markup language, is something we support a subset of it. So it's basically some custom speech tags that you can include in your response for things like having a break in the actual output speech, having incoming audio. So if you have a static audio file hosted and you don't want to use our text-to-speech engine, you want to use recorded audio talent, you can directly insert that into your response so that the user hears like a very realistic human audio recording or even some little sounds in your response. So that's pretty powerful. This app doesn't use very much of it, but we have a Number Genie app, which is also in our GitHub repo, in our GitHub org, excuse me, which uses that quite a bit. And I highly recommend that you use that. It makes the experience just a lot better. But anyway, that was a tangent. So for instance, now if I choose history, what's happening is the history utterance is getting sent to Dialogflow.
Sure, here's a history fact. Would you like to hear another fact?
The utterance got sent to Dialogflow. Dialogflow recognized that I'm actually talking about the choose fact intent. So the intent is triggered. It also recognizes the entity, which is the actual word history. So that gets passed as a parameter to my code. And then my code, which I showed you earlier, basically constructs this rich visual response with a card, with this URL, suggestion chips. And then that response is sent all the way back through up to the user. So just to give another brief example, let's say, like I mentioned earlier, you can ask about cats. So the cat's intent is trained to listen for the user asking, literally about cats. So some of the examples that I've in Dialogflow are cats, cat facts, I want to hear about cats. But let's say something a little different, like tell me about cats, right? So this is a phrase that Dialogflow has not been given as an explicit example. But ideally, through grammar expansion,
all right, here's a cat
it
fact.
recognized it and matched that same intent, told my endpoint about the fact that the user was asking about cats. The endpoint, my Firebase function, constructed this response, sent it back, and it went all the way back through to the user. And once you're testing an app,
new.
Say that one more time.
Is grammar expansion new? Something I don't kind of remember that last year with the dialogue.
Grammar expansion has been there. It's it may not have been articulated, but
okay.
That is one of the sort of powerful features that Dialogflow or API AI previously has had for quite some time. But yeah, that's the kind of the power, is that you don't have to know everything the user is going to say. You have to have an idea of what the user will say, and it'll figure out the rest for you. And so I don't know if you noticed, by the way, in the audio.
All right, here's a cat fact.
There's a very quiet purr, which you may have heard, and that's actually SSML taking an static audio file and inserting it into the outgoing response. So that gives you some idea of how you can kind of play with it and have something cool going on there. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. I highly recommend you check out this sample and our other samples and try them out. But I'll leave some time, I guess, for maybe some questions.
Yeah, definitely. Some of you that are online, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I can promote you to a panelist so you can ask your question live. Nobody's really put any in the Q&A. You definitely covered, it was great. It was high level enough and deep enough at the same time. Even that, I think for me, the clarifying, like, okay, what is Google Assistant versus what are the actions versus what is the dialogue, and like where these pieces tie into. And it actually looks fairly simple, right? It's always like that on paper, right? When you do a demo like this for code. Is there anything, obviously you've probably done this at some other hackathons, you've probably seen people build some integrations on it. Are there a couple of integrations that you find unique or interesting, or have you seen anything that's really unique to small business? Are there ideas you'd like to see built, possibly?
Well, yeah, in terms of ideas I'd like to see built, definitely we are ambitiously hoping that the community really picks up, and there's a lot of neat ideas. I think right now, so just to give an example of some cool apps that are already out there. There's one called Horrible Hangman, which is pretty fun. It's very simple. It's just a hangman game, but the persona is very captivating and it makes it really fun. There's another very high quality one called I think Credit Card Helper. So this one suggests credit cards based on your preferences in terms of what kind of rewards you want, or I'm not sure if it does like credit-based filtering or not, but like stuff like that. And the really cool thing about the app is that it's well built out, the dialogue. So you have quite a few features, but it's not overwhelming. There's also very rich visual interactions if you use their app on a mobile device. So I think things like that are pretty cool ideas, like where you can suggest things to the user. Like I was mentioning laptop purchasing earlier, but credit card suggestions, that's a very cool app. I think one of the things that I try to recommend when like agencies and companies come talk to us and stuff is that, like I was mentioning earlier, thinking about out of the box, unconventional ways that people interact with your service and leveraging those. So if you're a utilities company or something, like the first thought you might have is, okay, I want users to be able to pay their bill through my conversational app. But paying bills through a conversational app is pretty hard. Like they might have a lot of questions. They might get off the rails of the conversation, they get easily frustrated and walk away. But I think one of the cool things is maybe if you're a utility business, maybe users interact with your services for other things, like just, I don't know, even scheduling an appointment, although that one's pretty hard, but maybe finding out about service outages or even finding out about the services you offer, like the pricing, right? Maybe going to the funnel part of your sort of business, your customer funnel. If they interact with your service just to figure out, with your conversation, just to figure out what the prices are, even if the other features aren't there, like paying bills and stuff like that, if you can make that part of the conversation really intriguing, make your brand look really powerful through the persona, you can actually, I think, leverage the platform really well and then build on that eventually as you see success and as you see analytics and growth and you figure out what's working and what's not working, then you can decide what to do from there. And then maybe you can even have transactions in your platform and stuff in your app.
So it sounds like strategy is shifting a little bit when it comes to like bots and chats and things like that, from away from like, oh, make it do these very specific tasks and it's kind of cold. I mean, the best way I could describe it, it's like DOS. Like it's very command line. You better know the next command and the next command, the next command to get everything done. And it's kind of shifting to where like, don't worry about having this deep set of features. Make the thing warm and fuzzy first. So people are wowed by it. They enjoy using the experience. Then as you get better at it and as they get more comfortable with it, then you can add those next deeper layers. It's kind of like a shift in mindset, even first, if I look at the last year to 18 months of developers building chatbots to QuickBooks, et cetera. So it sounds like people are really, from an industry perspective, I think it feels like the way you guys even presented, it's just a different strategy now.
You 100% hit the nail on the head for two reasons. One is you've picked up on the fact that, like, yeah, you're right. It's not like a chatbot platform. And then two is that it is very much that transition from, like you were mentioning earlier, command line based, terminal based programs to a more evolved form of interaction. So yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there, I think, pretty much. Yeah.
Awesome. I think on that, then we'll wrap up. I do thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes.
Enjoy, everybody. Please, if you are not watching this live, check out all the other videos. Feel free to. If they need to reach out to you, is the best place on your Google Plus?
Yeah, that's the best place. We monitor it regularly, so yeah.
And there's a forum just for Google Actions and Google Assistant.
Yes.
There, is that correct? Okay, got it. So do you want to head to the Google Plus if you need help there? We should have, I think, I don't want to promise, but at the hackathon, I think we'll set up, like we did last year, a Slack channel, and then you'd be able to ask questions inside of there as well. We'll spin up a Slack channel at the hackathon as well. So with that said, I will see everybody next week. Don't forget next week's Nexmo. All right.
Thanks,
bye,
David.
everybody. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Bye.